not understand that we...
Go ahead.
I want to support one of the former callers about...
Coast to Coast, the program where Canadians speak their minds.
Welcome to Coast. I'm Danielle Kiefler, filling in for Ann Petrie. Today's story began nearly 80 years ago. It started during the earliest years of Canadian settlement, when immigrants were wooed to Canada with the promise of free land. Ukrainians came by the thousands and were considered ideal citizens of this new country. That is, until the First World War, when Ukrainians from the Austro-Hungarian border became allies of Germany, and that made them enemies of Canada, even those who lived in Canada. Some 5,000 Ukrainian men, women, and children were interned in prison camps across Canada. That's something Ukrainians haven't forgotten, but they say the Canadian government has. The government has never acknowledged that the camps ever existed, and even some children of the survivors now deny they ever existed. That's what 84-year-old Mary Haskett found. She is the last known survivor of the camps. She now belongs to the Redress Council of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association. It's trying to get the government to acknowledge this part of Canada's history. Today on Coast to Coast, Ukrainian internees, what should be done? Call us with your questions and comments toll-free from anywhere in Canada. The numbers are 1-800-665-1433, or if you live in Calgary, the number is 521-6285. I'm joined now by Frances Haskett, the daughter of the last known survivor of one of these internment camps, and Lubomir Luchuk, Director of Research for the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Ms. Haskett, I'm wondering, when your mother first started to talk to you about her experience in this camp in northern Quebec, did you believe her?
No. We wanted to believe her, but we just couldn't. My brothers and my sister, Diane, we would look at the map, and we would look in Ontario, northern Ontario, we looked at northern Quebec, and there was no such place as Spirit Lake. So it wasn't that we didn't want to believe her, but there was no evidence to support the story. And there was...
What was her story? What kinds of experiences did she share with you?
Well, she used to from time to time say that we were lucky, we were growing up in much better conditions than what she had experienced as a child, and that when she was a young child, she was taken away with her family to the bush in the northern part of the province, and had to live in that camp for a number of years. She said it was very rough. There were soldiers all around. She was only 6 years old. She was, she was born in Canada in 1908 in Montreal. So she was 6 years old, but she still has, a substantial recall because it was so traumatic, I would think. If you could imagine, having lived in the country and then for no good reason, all of a sudden you and your parents are forced to go to a place that certainly wasn't part of the original dream. So her memories, are that it was certainly a place where people were killed if they tried to escape. You had to have a pass if you went beyond the certain confines of the camp to a village nearby. This is what she has told us.
It must have been incredibly shocking to hear her recount those experiences to the point of perhaps not wanting to believe her.
Yes, because, we're proud Canadians, and I guess, to think that could happen in Canada to a Canadian citizen, and also to have her sister die in the camp, to have a loss of life of a Canadian, somebody born in Canada, and, to die in the camp. It was very hard for us to understand that, and we thought maybe that it might have happened in the Ukraine somewhere, that she might have heard that story. We just couldn't believe it, and there was nothing in the history books. None of our friends that are of Ukrainian extraction knew anything about it. So what were we to believe? It was very, very sad.
How did her experience affect you? How did the passing on of that experience affect your consciousness as a Ukrainian Canadian?
Well, I think our consciousness was certainly it certainly changed when we became aware through Dr. Luchuk's book that there indeed was a spirit lake, and this indeed happened. So from that point, we have done everything possible to make sure that this part of our history is acknowledged, and my mother receives some sort of acknowledgement and an apology from the government.
Dr. Luchuk, I'm wondering, you have done a tremendous amount of research on this experience of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. Can you give us a sense of what the grounds were upon which the Canadian government justified rounding up all of these people and putting them into as many as 26 camps across Canada?
Well, essentially what happened, Danielle, was that at the outbreak of the war, the government decided that all Austro-Hungarian citizens in this country should be deemed enemy aliens, with a few exceptions. Most of the 171,000 Ukrainians who had been lured to Canada by promises of freedom and free land came from Western Ukraine, primarily from Halachina and Bukovina. These are two western regions of Ukraine. As such, they came bearing Austro-Hungarian passports, and they appeared to be citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with which Canada, as part of the British Empire, was at war. Of course, there was no evidence of any sympathy or loyalty to Austro-Hungary among the Ukrainian community in this country. Many of them had fled there, preferring to come to Canada and risk everything rather than be conscripted into the armed forces of Imperial Hungary, Austro-Hungary. They were interned, therefore, on the basis of citizenship, even though they protested their loyalty many times. There are many letters and articles in newspapers and so on by Ukrainian Canadians saying, look, we do not support the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We want to be good Canadians. We want to serve in the armed forces of this country and contribute to the nation's growth. In fact, what's particularly appalling is that in January and again in February of 1915, within a few months of the outbreak of the war, Ottawa was told by the British government that Ukrainians were quote-unquote friendly aliens who should be given preferential treatment. And yet measures taken against them grew worse, not only internment and categorization as enemy aliens, but the confiscation of properties and valuables, which were in many cases never returned, eventually disenfranchisement, censorship, selective deportation, and of course all of the traumas associated with what another newspaper described as a national humiliation.
Well, if the British government were advising against the internment camps, that sort of begs the question, why do you think the Canadian government persisted?
Well, there are no good explanations because, unfortunately, the Canadian government in the early 1950s destroyed the paper trail. Most of the archives about the first national internment operation of this country were destroyed in the 50s and 60s by Ottawa at the National Archives of Canada, which an Edmonton historian, Petro Milnitsky, discovered. We actually had to go to the British Public Record Office and to the U.S. State Department archives to find copies of some of those documents so that we could reconstruct or begin a partial reconstruction of the history. We do know that there was a great deal of racist sentiment against Ukrainians before and at the early part of the century. Ukrainians were described in extremely condescending, ignorant, and racist ways. And so part of it was, of course, some of that. There was also, of course, the hysteria and the xenophobia that breaks out at the beginning of any war, and perhaps that's understandable. What is not understandable is why things got worse for these friendly aliens who were, in fact, loyal citizens of this country. It really is a great blank spot in Canadian history that we've been patiently trying to fill in now for nearly 8 years with, unfortunately, virtually no help and some hindrance from the federal government.
Well, this brings me to the next question. I know that you've been discussing, negotiating, having approached the federal government for many years, and that discussion sort of has escalated since 1988, just before the last federal election. How much progress have you made, and if you could outline for us what your demands are?
Well, unfortunately, I have to report to a Canadian audience today that the progress of our efforts have been, at best, modest. In the early 1980s, we began researching this, and we began putting forward our requests, not demands, our requests, beginning in the late 87. But our first official meetings, if you like, with Mr. Jerry Weiner, the Minister of Multiculturalism and Citizenship, took place in the fall of 1988. So we date, as it were, the beginning of our negotiations from the fall of 1988. From the very beginning, we have said that we want 4 things, and this has not changed. We want, first of all, the government to acknowledge that what happened to Ukrainian Canadians and others during Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920 was unwarranted and unjust. So simply an acknowledgement. We do not believe that you can ask a government of today to apologize for this unjust deed of a government 75 years ago. So it's simply a question of acknowledging that what happened was wrong. We're asking the Government of Canada to amend the Emergencies Act of 1988. The original legislation that was used to intern Ukrainians in Canada was the War Measures Act. This was passed in 1914. The very same piece of legislation, in essence, was used to intern Japanese Canadians in 1941, and again in 1970 was used against the Quebecois. So we're saying when you change the War Measures Act to the Emergencies Act in 1988, make sure that what happened to Ukrainian Canadians never happens again to any other Canadian ethnic, religious, or racial minority. And we've been hammering on that point because we do not believe the current legislation really does protect minorities against a possible repeat performance. If you think that perhaps I'm exaggerating this, you only have to ask any Canadian of Islamic heritage how he or she felt during the Gulf War to know the meaning of fear. Thirdly, we're asking the Government of Canada, through Environment Parks Canada Service, to put historical markers or plaques at all 26 of the receiving stations and concentration camp sites across Canada. We believe that you need to plaque these sites so that people traveling by them will remember what once happened there, again, hopefully, so that it never happens again. In particular, we would like the government to put up a major exhibit and interpretive center, perhaps some kind of museum, at the Castle Mountain site in Banff National Park. Many Canadians to this day do not realize that many of the roads, and indeed the golf course in Banff National Park, were built by Ukrainian indentured slave labor, in effect. And finally, we're asking for some kind of symbolic financial compensation. There can be really no question of individual redress here, because as you've correctly pointed out, the last known survivor of these internment operations, Mrs. Haskett, and the few other survivors we still found when we began this research have never asked for personal indemnification. But we're asking for some kind of research fund, educational fund, community development fund to be administered either by an independent foundation or by the Government of Canada so that more work can be done on the Ukrainian experience in Canada and so that our contributions to this country will be properly recognized in the history books and in the educational system, commemorated, and again, all with a major purpose being to ensure that it never happens to any other community again.
Professor Lechuk, at this point, I think we'd like to go to our phone lines. We have Tim in Winnipeg. Go ahead, Tim. What do you think should be done for Ukrainian internees?
Well, first of all, I think that when you look back, our government is no better than what the Nazis were back in the Second World War by interning the Jews, by killing the Jews. I'm sorry, I don't agree that, they made such a big stink over the Japanese in the Second World War and monetarily, correcting their mistake from the Second World War. I think that it's about time the government turned around, got their butts in gear, and looked at this situation and said, hey, this happened. Quit trying to sweep it under the mat. I mean, our governments for the last 30, 40, 50 years have been trying to sweep bad publicity, i.e. the Ukrainian internment, the Japanese internment, under the mat. And now it's time that they sat there and faced up to their problems and faced up to their mistakes.
Well, thanks for that comment, Tim.
Thank you.
We now go to Port Alberni, and we have Pete on the line. Hi, Pete. What do you think should be done for Ukrainian internees?
Oh, well, I definitely think that there should be some recompense made for this. That's very important. I think it's kind of interesting that people don't hear a lot about Japanese Canadians being interned during World War II, but it was only until very recently that I learned that Ukrainian Canadians had been interned at all in this country.
Well, how old are you, by the way, if I may ask?
I'm 22.
Had you ever heard about this, except for, say, in the last year or two? Did you learn this in your history books when you were in grade school or high school?
Yeah, it was in my Canadian history course at college. I learned about that.
But not before college?
No. And about the War Measures Act, I don't know if it's even all that important if we should have a War Measures Act at all. I mean, I don't know, what purpose does it serve exactly, other than for the government to push people around, I guess.
Well, you've mentioned two things here. You've mentioned the importance of some sort of compensation, and you've also mentioned legislation, the War Measures Act. I would like to ask our professor guest if he could tell us the importance of compensation. It doesn't sound to me like this is at the top of your list in terms of financial compensation.
No, it's not at the top of our list of requests to the Government of Canada. We've always felt that the most important thing is to remember so that it never happens again. And that's why historical markers, exhibits, plaques, some kind of public acknowledgement in the House of Commons are what we have been particularly interested in pursuing. It's too late for most people who were interned. Even if there are some other survivors that we haven't found, it's too late really to do much for them individually. But we have felt that some kind of symbolic financial compensation is appropriate. We have a survey that was done by Price Waterhouse, which determined that the loss to the community in terms of lost wages alone, calculated in 1991 dollars, would be several tens of millions in terms of contemporary money. This does not include, of course, the pain and suffering, the unlawful internment. You have the Marshall precedent, for example, from the Maritimes. Imagine applying that times 5,000, and you can see that the total bill, if anyone wanted to submit it, would be horrendous. And of course, no Canadian of Ukrainian heritage would even begin to think, saying to the public in these times particularly, compensate us in the amount of X hundred billion, whatever dollars. That would be inappropriate, and in fact it would do no service to the memory of those who suffered. So what we're asking for is some kind of educational fund, some kind of fund that would serve as a symbolic apology, if you like, although I hesitate to use that word, to those who can no longer even hear that acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong, but something that would allow for materials to be put into the educational system. Markers, films, for example. We have a young filmmaker from Montreal who's been working on his own for several years now, trying to do a feature-length documentary on the internment operations with virtually no support because the funds are not there in our community, and of course the federal government has not been particularly forthcoming in support of this. We believe that in a sense, if people had understood better the travesty of justice that occurred in World War I, perhaps what happened to our Japanese-Canadian friends wouldn't have happened in the Second World War. Perhaps the threat that hung over many Quebecois in 1970 would not have happened. Perhaps the fear that my friends in the Canadian Arab community felt in the 1990 Gulf War would not have been there. We can't say, of course, you can never be sure, but I think these steps are essential. And this is why we've, of course, structured a National Redress Council that includes civil libertarians from all walks of life, all political stripes, from many different ethnocultural communities to support us in advancing the principle of acknowledgement and redress.
Okay, back to our phone lines now. We have Rita in Ottawa. Go ahead, Rita.
Yes, hi. First of all, I want to say that I'm sorry what happened to the Ukrainians, the Japanese, and whatever. But, you know, how far back do we go? Do we go back to 1755 when the Acadians were booted out of Nova Scotia, put in boats, half of them perished? You know, we humans can be very, very stupid. And, but I don't think the compensation should be, certainly I was not involved in that. And I would ask your guests, when they heard about the Acadians, what happened to them?
So what you're saying...
Did you learn about it from the history books at school? Had you even heard about it?
Well, as a matter of fact, I can answer that. Yes, it was taught in my Canadian history classes at high school level, and I've since read much more about it. And I certainly am aware of that as a particularly dark episode in British imperial history. But this is not the Canadian government taking action against a minority group in this country. This is, in fact, a British transgression. I certainly think it should be recognized, commemorated. Many books have been written about the subject. It's not that difficult to read about. If you open Mel Hurtig's Encyclopedia of Canada, you'll see quite a large section there on the Acadian tragedy and the Acadian diaspora today. You won't find a word about the Ukrainian internment operations.
We'll have to throw to commercial now. We'll be right back to take more of your calls when Coast to Coast returns after this short break. back to Coast. I'm Danielle Kiefler, filling in for Ann Petrie. Ukrainians interned in Canada during the Second World War are looking for recognition from the Canadian government, but so far they've not been successful. Today we're taking your calls on Ukrainian internees. What should be done? My guests are Frances Haskett, daughter of the last known survivor of the camps, and Lumomir Luchuk, Director of Research for the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Before we take more calls, Ms. Haskett, I'd like to ask you something. Just before the commercial break, we heard from a caller who said, look, history has been very unjust. Many groups have been persecuted. Many have been treated unfairly. It isn't fair to keep asking the Canadian taxpayer to pay for the evils of previous Canadian governments. What do you say to people like that?
Well, again, I think if you look at the four requests that Lumomir outlined originally, some kind of symbolic financial consideration, mainly for educational purpose, has been asked. We're not asking for individual compensation. Certainly my mother is the last survivor, and some people might wonder why we're not asking for the funds to be directed to her alone, but you know, we're representing not only my mother, but all the other people that were unjustly interred.
Okay,
Does that
back to
answer your question?
Yes, it certainly does. Back to the phone lines now. We have Jelena in Richmond Hill. Please go ahead. You're on Coast to Coast.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I'd like to say to your guest that I'm really sorry what's happened with your people. I am going through personal feelings right now what's happening to my people. I'm Serbian, and I wonder just are we are going to be put in camps and our houses are going to be taken, because that's how government behaving towards us here. We don't have a voice. We don't have anything. They put Yugoslavia like in big camps. Are we going to go through this?
Okay, Professor, I wonder if we could pursue this question of the legislation. One of your four requests is to make sure that there's no way that what happened to your community could happen again. Do you feel that communities of all kinds in Canada are safe today?
The short answer is no, I don't. When the government began amending the War Measures Act of 1914 in 1988 and created the Emergencies Act, as it's now called, submissions were made by lawyers representing the Ukrainian Canadian community and by the Japanese Canadian community, warning the government that the legislation as it was being crafted, theoretically at least, might allow for another incident of mass repression of the sort that Ukrainian Canadians had experienced during the First World War. The government did not, unfortunately, take all of our revisions and recommendations to heart. And so the legislation, as it stands, at least in theory, could provide for a repeat performance. I don't want to be alarmist about this, but we think that the most modest request we have is that the government simply re-examine that legislation in consultation with our lawyers and other communities who feel that they have some standing on this issue, and make sure that it is safe in the sense of protecting the civil liberties and human rights of individual Canadians and also the collective rights of communities. No community in this country has ever been disloyal. Communities aren't disloyal. Individuals may be. You should seek out and, where necessary, punish individuals who may commit crimes or of various sorts, but you can't blame or scapegoat entire communities. Unfortunately, in times of domestic or international crisis, that sometimes happens. I feel very sad to hear what this Serbian Canadian lady is saying. Serbs were among the East Europeans who were interned in this country in the First World War. Not very many of them. There were also Croatians, Jews, Poles, some Germans, some Austrians who were actual citizens of Canada, and others, all citizens of that multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire that we mentioned at the outset. We know that Japanese Canadians and others were interned in the Second World War. We all remember, I think, 1970 and the quote-unquote suspended insurrection in Quebec. How do we know it's not going to happen again? I remember speaking to my friends of Islamic
I'd actually just like to maybe get back to the phone lines, because we have a couple of people who are waiting to share their comments with us. We'd like to go to Calgary and Bob. Bob, what do you think should be done for Ukrainian internees?
Hello.
Hello.
Well, first let me say that I absolutely agree with the professor's comments about revising the legislation, by taking all steps to ensure that this kind of activity does not occur again. I absolutely agree that we should be cautious about allowing the government to, quote, destroy the paper trail of true history. But I also take quite a strong position that history is history. And we learn from our mistakes as much as we learn from what we did right. And therefore, I take quite a bit of exception to this idea that we're going to go back and apply 1993 politically correct thinking to 1914 thoughts. The fact is that the people in 1914 acted in what was then perfectly proper, correct, accepted politically activity. And therefore, we should not now go back some 75 years and try and apologize for something that was not unacceptable in those days. The fact that we have learned something over the last few generations is indeed encouraging, and I think we should do that. But I'm a senior citizen, and I can assure you, I have never raped, pillaged, or plundered a single Indian village. I have never attacked or interned a Japanese. But I can guarantee you, and I don't think that the taxpayers, today's taxpayers, should be held liable for politically correct things that may have happened 50, 100 years ago.
Okay, just a second, Bob. I'd like to put this to Francis Haskett. My understanding is you're not asking for an apology. You're asking for what happened to be acknowledged.
Acknowledged, yes.
So you're asking for Canadians to be made aware of what happened and educated about what happened.
That's right, because you can appreciate my mother has 7 grandchildren, and there's just nothing in any of the Canadian books, history books that we're aware of that points this out. And there's so we want to ensure that any funds that the government will supply will go towards that sort of activity, to have more education, and also to have markers put up at the camps, so that when people are visiting out in Banff, for instance, they're going to be aware of some of the barbed wire that's still there was keeping Ukrainians, in the camp situation during the last World War. Lubomir has probably something more to say about that. I'm just familiar more with the Spirit Lake where my mother was.
Sure. Before we get to that, though, we do have some people on the phone lines. We have Adeline from Edmonton. Please go ahead. You're on Coast to Coast.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you, Coast to Coast, for having this excellent program. I'm nearly in tears. I want to congratulate Professor Lusiak and Mrs. Haskett. Yes, the Ukrainians should be acknowledged, and there should be a monetary, symbolic donation or whatever from the government to somehow indicate an apology and a future for the Ukrainians in Canada. Did you know that although Canada is considered a melting pot of nations, without any kind of discrimination within our wonderful Canada, there is a subtle, covert, discriminatory bias against Canadians who are Ukrainian. Unless you are a WASP, in fact, you should keep it a secret. If you are Ukrainian, I can name you, but I will not. I am a registered nurse. I can name you hospitals that do not employ Ukrainians. I can name you department stores that do not. And I want to say, let this be a beginning for us, and let's go from here.
Thanks for that call, Adeline. We now go to Ray in Victoria. Please go ahead, Ray. You're on Coast to Coast. Hello, Ray. Are you there?
Try Mary.
We're having a little trouble here, but we're going to go to Mary in Napier. Please go ahead, Mary. You're on Coast to Coast.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
I just wanted to say I don't know why do they insist on being recognized. It's a little bit difficult for me to understand. My father came from Ireland. He fought for 4 years in the First World War, and after that was all over, he stayed in Canada, and he raised 4 children during the Depression. Nobody gave him a handout, and he didn't have any easier time than people that came out of camps. So what I want to know is, I don't think that we should, maybe if they want to be recognized, they could really explain it to us.
Well, Professor, why don't you take a quick shot at it?
Sure. If I can just answer that, I'm sure the country, and certainly we appreciate the contribution your people made to this country. On our Redress Council, we have members of the Irish-Canadian community who are now pressing the Government of Canada to do something about commemorating the Irish dead at the Grosse Ile site outside Quebec City. We support them and they support us. But it isn't simply a question of recognition. We had Canadian Ukrainians who changed their names, lied about where they were born and who they were, and served overseas in the First World War. One of them, Philippe Coneval, won the Victoria Cross, which I'm sure you know is the highest medal the Empire gave out. Another man whose case record we have, Nick Honemod, actually volunteered in August of 1914. He was a homesteader in Alberta. He married a Canadian-born woman. He was a Canadian citizen. He volunteered. He served overseas in the Western Front until he was invalided out. When he was returned to Halifax on board a hospital ship, he said, "At last I can admit who I am." When he did, they interned him in Halifax as an enemy
Professor,
alien.
she suggests, the caller is suggesting that the Irish-Canadian experience and the Ukrainian-Canadian experience are parallel, are similar. Do you buy that?
Well, no, I don't. I mean, there are clear differences. Of course, many people of many different backgrounds, religious, cultural, racial, and so on, worked hard, suffered, had successes and had failures in this country. Irish, Ukrainians, Chinese, Jews, many of different kinds of backgrounds. But to say that the experience of someone that fought and raised a family during the difficult times of the Depression is the same as someone who came here to find freedom and free land and who worked hard as well as a homesteader, and then one night, overnight, was declared to be an enemy alien and interned unjustly with no reason, kept for several years in a camp, lost an opportunity to build a family, to advance himself economically, was stigmatized by this. Many people died in those camps or suffered permanent physical and mental injuries. You can't compare the two experiences. The closest comparison is the similarity of the Japanese-Canadian experience in the Second World War and that of some other internees. Obviously, many different peoples have contributed to the building of this country, and they did so through blood, sweat, and tears. And that we do recognize in the multicultural society we have today.
Okay, we'd just like to go back to the phone lines, if we may, Professor. We have Christina in Montreal. Please go ahead. You're on Coast to Coast.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I don't agree that something should be done for Ukrainian minority here.
And why would that be?
During the Second World War, actually, in 30s, there was Ukrainian organization, nationalistic organization, which was supported by Hitler. The head of the organization, Stepan Bandera, was having meetings with Goebbels and was getting money from him. The organization was financed by Hitler. Those people were they were murdering, they were really, everybody was afraid of them. When the Germans came in to Western Ukraine, West Ukraine, in 1941, they were waiting for them with the flowers. They there was no draft for Ukrainian into the German army. They were volunteers. They had 2 Ukrainian divisions in German army fighting. I remember the name of one of them was called Kalishina. I don't remember the other name of the other division. But they were full divisions, Ukrainians who were fighting with the Germans. They were involved in killing of the Jews. Not even, they were terrible things. They were taking the eyes out. This is what was done during the war.
Professor, I wonder if I could just sort of summarizing her point here. Are these arguments that you've heard before, that the political and military relationship between the Ukrainians and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and relationships during the Second World War are good reason not to compensate or do justice, in your terms, for your community here in Canada?
Well, without pointing out the many historical inaccuracies that this woman just perpetrated. Let me simply point out that the experience of Ukraine during the Second World War has absolutely nothing to do with what Ukrainians experienced in this country in the First World War. Whether or not, and let's just leave it as an open question, some Ukrainians collaborated with Nazi Germany in the Second World War should have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not Ukrainians who had come to this country in the teens of this century or before that were unjustly interned. I mean, this lady obviously speaks with passion and conviction, and you have to respect that. But we did have a commission of inquiry on war criminals in this country, headed by Mr. Justice Jules Deschamps, which began its work in 1985, continued through to 1987, reported that there was no evidence of any war crimes on the part of that Galician division that the lady mentioned. You know, this war criminal issue is something completely separate and apart. And if it's an issue that you want to talk about, we certainly can. But it has nothing to do with the experience, for example, of Mrs. Haskett, who was born in Montreal and as a 6-year-old girl was interned in a Spirit Lake internment camp. How that and World War II should be related here, I mean, it's a fraud, it's a canard, it's a red herring that's being tossed in to try to somehow discredit what is an honorable and just cause. Okay, back to the phone lines now. We have Joe in Hamilton. Please go ahead, Joe.
Hi. My father arrived in Canada in 1912, and he worked 2 years at Clay Bay Mine. The First World War broke out. He enlisted. He served 5 years in the Big War, and he was at Vimy Ridge. After he returned, he had been promised $10,000 cash.
Pardon, is your background Ukrainian, sir? Or are you Ukrainian? You are, yes. Okay.
Anyway, he returned and was promised approximately 10,000 acres of land and $10,000. He did not receive it, but it didn't bother Dad. He returned. Second World War broke out. He was brought in a few times to the RCMP station and questioned as to his beliefs in the communist movement.
Mary Haskett, I wondered, what you're hearing now, does this relate a lot back to the kinds of experiences you're familiar with in terms of your mother and people of her generation?
Well, I think that they certainly, well, as far as my mother has indicated, they were certainly just rounded up and taken away to the camp without any explanation. I don't know if I don't know if that really applies to Joe, is it from Hamilton? It's a little different. And what he's trying to say is maybe that if you have an accent that you're, perhaps that there's been in our Canadian history, if you had any kind of an accent, there's always been a little bit of a trouble on the part of the authorities to give you a fair shake. Perhaps that's what he's saying.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you both very much for being with us today. Frances Haskett, who is the daughter of the last known survivor of the camps, and Professor Luchuk from Kingston, Ontario. That's all the time we have for this edition of Coast to Coast. Brian Yasui's next with Life Today, and I'll be back tonight at 9.